If you've been following with us in our series in Ecclesiastes, you might be wondering why we're jumping all the way to Ecclesiastes 7 and kind of skipping over chapter 6 and the first few verses of chapter 7. But the book of Ecclesiastes, it's a little bit of a different book. It's kind of almost like a book of prophecy in the sense that it has these repeating themes. That it's kind of like a cyclical book. And so chapter 6 is a repeat of what we've already studied in chapters 1 and 2. And the first verses of chapter 7 are actually what's going to get picked up and what we're going to hear preached on next week in Ecclesiastes chapter 9. So instead of kind of camping out on each verse, what we've been doing to make our way through this book is looking at the themes. And this morning, we see a theme given to us, the theme of adversity. Verse 13 starts by asking a question. Right? It said, "Consider the works of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked?" Straight is what is easy. If you're on a straight path, you can easily see where you're going. The shortest distance between 2 points is what? A straight line. And so the straight is meant to symbolize that which is fast, that which is easy, that which is best. But live life long enough and you'll realize things aren't always straight. You can be walking straight and everything seems fine, and then all of a sudden you seem to just get like hit out of nowhere by a curve in the road. This is the crooked way that verse 14 links to adversity. Right? Verse 14 says, "In the day of prosperity be joyful," that's the straight, "and in the day of adversity consider. God's made one as well as the other." And so prosperity is kind of the straight and easy, and adversity is the difficult, the bending, the hard. This crooked way is some trouble or difficulty in life that we wish we could change, but that we just cannot alter. Perhaps it is the physical limitations that we experience in our bodies. Or maybe it's the just breakdown of personal or family relationships. Or it's just something that we wish we did not have but do. Or something we wish we did have but don't. I mean, what is one thing that if you could change it in your life, you would? I'm sure we can all answer that question. This season that we're living in is certainly a turn in the path that none of us saw coming, and I know all of us wish we didn't have to take. Today, our passage is going to show us how to move forward when life takes a turn. I've been telling this morning's sermon how to have hope when life goes sideways. How to have hope when life goes sideways. And learn to have hope is crucial if we're going to thrive in this life with all of its twists and turns. Viktor Frankl, who's a Holocaust survivor and famous author, said that those who lasted the longest in the concentration camps and increased their chances of survival were those who were able to find something to hope for. There's a surviving power that hope can give us. And that's what Ecclesiastes 7, verses 13 through 18 want to lead us to. That surviving power of hope. And this hope comes through really 3 shifts we need to make. 3 shifts we need to make. I used to drive a stick shift car until I moved into this city. And I did that for like 2 weeks. And I'm like, man, I got to get rid of this thing because who wants to shift every block? It's ridiculous. But out in the suburbs where you used to be able to pick up some speed, if you're going to take a turn, and kids, you don't hear me saying this because you're going to always drive the speed limit, right? Yeah, I'm sure. So anyways, if you're taking the turn and maybe not going the speed limit, not that I have firsthand knowledge of that, but what you want to do is you want to downshift in order to be able to hit the turn and not lose control. Right? If you want to hit a turn and really do it well and cut it hard and cut it sharp, you downshift. And so today we're going to see 3 shifts we need to make. That as life kind of throws us for a turn, 3 shifts we need to make in order to keep moving forward the way God wants us to. And so here's the first shift that's going to kind of lead us to hope. We need to shift from anger at the curve to faith in the guide. We need to shift from anger at the curve to faith in the guide. Verse 13 says, God is the one who makes things crooked. Verse 14 repeats this by saying, God's the one who makes the day of adversity. When we go through hard times, I think we can try to cope with it by trying to get God off the hook. And act like, well, God somehow was caught surprised, he doesn't know what's going on, and he's kind of helpless. Like, he didn't see us coming, and he can do nothing about it. Like, we don't think like, well, God has nothing to do with this challenge that I'm going through. But think about that for a moment. If God was caught surprised, and God has nothing to do with what you're going through, even the hard things you're going through, doesn't that actually make God pretty small and pathetic? I mean, that's not all how God's portrayed in the Bible. God's never caught by surprise by anything. Isaiah 46:10 says that God is the God who knows the beginning from the end. Psalm 62:11 says that God is all-powerful over all things at all times. And we should want God to be this way. I mean, a God who's caught surprised by life, he really can't do anything about life, can he? I mean, his promises mean nothing. How can we believe his promise of salvation, something as fundamental to our faith as that? How can we believe that God can actually make good on his promise to give us salvation if there's something that could happen that's outside his control? I mean, what if there's something that he didn't see coming and he didn't plan for, and it just totally changes everything? See, a God who's not all-knowing and a God who's not all-powerful is not always in control, and quite frankly, he's just a God not worth giving even a second thought to. But if God is all-knowing and God is all-powerful, which is how he's clearly portrayed in Scripture, then why does verse 13 and 14 say that he makes things crooked? Now, this can't mean that this crooked is something evil that's happening, because God certainly cannot be the author of evil. By his divine nature, God and evil are incompatible with one another. The Bible is very clear on that. People are responsible for the sinful choices that they make. No one can blame God for that. But there's a ton that we go through in life that's not necessarily the result of someone sinning against us. It's just challenges that are happening to us. And so I've had a chronic illness for 3 decades. My wife and I have had to mourn through 2 miscarriages. And you just ask the question, God, why? Why? Why do you allow this physical limitation in my life? Why do you allow this pain to exist? Why would you give us the joy of a baby only to snatch it away? Like, it would just be better if she was never even pregnant. And I'll be honest, there can be anger in that why. There can be anger in that why. Praise God that he's big enough to handle our emotions. Do you know that? God is big enough to handle your emotions. Like, you can be honest with him. He's able to take it. But the answer of verse 14 to these angry questions of why that we can have, God, why would you make this crooked? Verse 14 does not give us the answer to why. Instead, what verse 14 does is it points us to who. It points us to who. We're told, consider God has made the one as well as the other. And do you see what this verse is doing? It's not saying, hey, consider, here's why God is doing this. No, that's not what it's saying. It's not saying, consider why God is doing this. No, it's saying, consider who God is. God is the one who makes the day of prosperity, and he's the one who makes the day of adversity. In other words, he's the guide who takes us on the straight path, and he's the one who takes us on the curve in our path. And so if we think he's worth trusting when life is going straight, then why should we start questioning him when life goes sideways? The guide hasn't changed, even though the path is now different. And so the one that we're praising for the good things in our life, he's the same God who's allowing this challenging thing to exist in our life. And so we really have a choice. We have a choice. we can choose to allow the bad things of life to let us reinterpret God. He must not be good. He must not be kind or loving. All the good things that he gave us were just kind of cosmic teases. That's one choice. Or we can let the good things of life secure us in who God is, even through the challenges that we are going through. I don't know why this is happening, but I trust the God who's been so good to me. And so, because he has been so good to me, he must be up to something good for me. You know, I think our challenge is that a lot of times we're a lot like Jesus' first disciples. You know, I mean, they were loving being around Jesus when he was doing miracles like feeding the 5,000. They were loving being around Jesus when the crowds were gathering to hear him preach. They loved being around Jesus when he rode on that donkey into Jerusalem and the masses came out and they're waving palm branches, like worshiping him as their king. Like, yeah, this is our guy. Like, we're with him. I could just see them taking selfies with Jesus. The people are worshiping in the background. They're like, yeah, me and Jesus, They loved Jesus when the path was straight. But then Friday happened. Jesus is arrested. The curve hits them. The disciples flee. Friday happens and Jesus is killed and the disciples go into hiding. Like their life had gone sideways and it ended up, in that moment, it just completely wiped them out. They liked Jesus when the path was what they expected, but when it took a turn, they all went down. But what they didn't realize when Friday was happening was that Sunday was coming. And the cross of Christ that took place on Friday was just setting up the resurrection of Jesus that was coming on Sunday. See, our problem is that we are like the disciples on that Friday. We see life with all of its disappointments and its challenges, and we can just get angry that God is not meeting our expectations. But friends, God did not come to meet our expectations. God came to exceed our expectations. See, on Friday, the disciples were upset that Jesus wasn't the earthly king they hoped for. But on Sunday, what they got was a heavenly salvation they could have never imagined in their wildest dreams. And so, friends, the gospel of Jesus, the good news of what he has done, the verifiable, historical fact of his resurrection, this gives us every reason to trust in the goodness of our God. We might not know why our guide is taking us down certain parts of our path. We might not get or understand every bend of the road, but we can have hope when we shift from anger at what's happening and start trusting in who's leading. We can have hope when we stop trying to interpret the guide based upon where we are on the path, but instead let what we know about the guide lead us to trust him for whatever part of the path we're on. In other words, hope comes when we do not let our present circumstances of adversity shape how we view God, but rather allow God's timeless goodness, proven through Christ, shape how we view our adverse circumstances. Maybe you're living in a Friday moment right now. Friends, as we look back in history and we see the Friday that led to a Sunday, that means that your Friday is leading to a Sunday as well. And every bend in the road has been brought to you by a guide who loves you and is committed to you. And he might not be meeting the expectation you had for him, but oh, friends, this is the guide who knows how to exceed our expectations. And so we can have hope when we shift from anger at what's happening and start trusting the guide who's leading. Second shift. We can have hope when we shift from trying to control to accepting what is given. We can have hope when we shift from trying to control to accepting what is given. Verse 15 notes something that we all know to be true. It says, there's a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in evil doing. Bad stuff can happen to good people, and good stuff can happen to bad people. We all know that to be true. We all experience it all the time. Verse 16 kind of gives a weird conclusion to that, though. Can we say that about the Bible? The Bible says weird things sometimes. But when we start thinking about the weird stuff and looking into the weird stuff, I mean, that's where the good stuff really is. So this is what verse 16 says. It says, "Be not overly righteous, and do not make yourself too wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" Now, is the Bible really telling us not to be righteous? Righteousness in the Bible means doing the right thing, like following God's way. And so is God really saying, like, hey, listen, I want you to do that, but don't try too hard. I mean, everything in moderation. Well, the key to interpreting this verse comes in the adjective modifiers. Kids, I know you're almost done school. Here's one more English lesson for you. Don't worry, summer break's coming, and I promise you your parents are looking forward to it even more than you are. But the adjective modifier is a word that describes the noun. It's the word that describes the noun. And so notice, it says overly righteous. Overly is the adjective modifier. It says too wise. Too is the adjective modifier. It's the idea of being excessive. It's doing even more than God has required. This is what the Pharisees were, weren't they? God said, hey, I want you to take a rest every 7 days. Pharisees are like, okay, we're going to take that and we're going to dial it up 10 notches. You know, we're not going to take this amount of steps, and we're not going to cook food in this kind of way. And they started being excessive in all these things that God had never told them to do in the first place. Why were they doing that? Well, it's the idea that, man, if you're righteous enough, if you're a good enough person, then God's going to owe you and is going to have to do what you want. I think it's very easy for us to try to put God in our debt through our righteous behavior. God, I'll do this for you so that you do this for me. We're trying to control God. Last week I talked about my dog Dawkins, and I love him. But there's no question in our relationship which one of us is in control. I am. He goes on a leash. I actually brought his leash in. Looks more like a small horse harness. But listen, my dog is stronger than me. My dog could really hurt me. But I'm able to put this leash on my dog, and I'm able to lead him around. Our problem can be that I think sometimes we want to put the leash on God. This leash represents our righteous, our excessively righteous acts. And so we want to think that, hey, if we can just, read enough and do enough and say the right things and give all these things, do our good deeds for God, like all of a sudden we've got God on a leash and he's going to do what we want. We try to control God, even though we're saying, hey, you're our God, but we're the ones who want to be holding the leash. Here's the problem with this, though. Verse 16 says, why should you destroy yourself? Why should you destroy yourself? See, when we try to control God, we end up losing ourselves. We actually end up losing a sense of our humanity, our creatureliness. Like, if God is controlled by you, then how can God do things that are beyond what you could even imagine? Friends, we shouldn't want God to be controlled by us. We shouldn't want God to be limited to us. We should want him to be beyond us so that he can exceed what we can even think. But if we're trying to control God by, I'm just going to be a good enough person to get God to do what I want, if we do that, then, our hope's going to die. Because here's what's going to happen. One of two things. One, you will never be able to be as good as you think you should be. And so you'll always be blaming yourself for the hard things of life. You want to make things a lot harder? Blame yourself for it. Oh, I wasn't righteous enough. That's why this is happening to me. That's a fast way to make your hope die. Or you'll realize that, I actually am doing good enough. I've done all these things for you. And you'll realize that actually your actions do not make one bit of difference in how you experience life. I've had Crohn's disease for 3 decades. As far as I know, Osama bin Laden was in the peak of health before he was taken out. And so I can try to bargain with God and control God and try to be a good enough Christian to get God to do what I want. But you know what's going to happen with that? I'm just going to waste a lot of effort, and it's going to result in dashed hope. But we can experience hope when we stop trying to control God and change what is, and instead submit to what God allows and use it to serve Him. Use it to serve Him. I mean, sometimes the very thing we want God to change is the greatest opportunity God has given us to serve Him. Sometimes our pain is the very thing that God has used to give us a platform. I mean, I listen better to people. I give them more of a platform into my life if I know they've been through some pain. I don't really trust people who say life's always been straight for them, because they're probably not being honest, or if they are being honest, then they don't know what my life's like. No, I want to hear from someone who knows what it's like for life to go sideways. And so acceptance of our situation, it does not mean that we doubt that God can change our situation, nor does it mean that we're not asking Him to change our situation. No, we can do that. I mean, I pray, been praying for 30 years almost, for God to heal me. I believe He can, and I pray that He will, regularly. I invite your prayers for me. I never turn down a prayer for that. Accepting, though, does not mean doubting God's power or care or being too scared to ask for Him to move. No, accepting means making our requests known, but trusting Him with the answer. It means making our requests known, but trusting Him with the answer. See, we can spend our energy trying to control God and change what He allows, or we can accept what God has allowed and use that same energy to do stuff for Him in the current situation that we are in. Like, we can waste our energy trying to control God and get out of the situation that He has put us in to serve Him, or we can use that same energy to serve God, not later, not when we've got figured out, not when we're on the other side. No, we can serve God in the midst of our pain. God uses people when they're on the bend, not just when they're going straight. When we move from control to acceptance, friends, when we move from trying to control God and change what God is doing and instead accept what God has allowed and say, listen, I'm serving you right now. My life has gone sideways and it's painful and I can't even get out of bed sometimes, but I'm serving you right now in the midst of my pain. Friends, our energy is much better used serving God than it is trying to control God. And so we can have hope when we move from shifting from control to shifting to acceptance. And then shift number three. We can have hope when we shift from pursuing independence to practicing surrender. From pursuing independence to practicing surrender. Ecclesiastes says, hey, don't try to be so righteous that you can control God. But then it goes on to say, don't just do whatever you want. Right, verse 17. Be not overly wicked, neither be a fool. Why should you die before your time? And this coupling here of wickedness and foolishness is really important. When we hear the word wicked, we think of people who are really, really bad. But that's not what's going on here. The backdrop of this is Psalm 14, which was written before Ecclesiastes. This is what Psalm 14, verse 1 says. The fool says in his heart, God does not exist. They are corrupt. All right, so the fool is the one who lives as a creature but denies that they have a creator. That's what is corrupt, or the same word for wicked. And so obviously there's lots of people who do good who don't believe in God. The Bible never denies that. But ultimately there's only one thing that is our greatest good. It makes me think of that line from the movie Incredibles. I don't know if you remember watching that, kids. Classic. But you got Frozone, who's the ice guy, right? And he's running out the door. And his wife's like, where are you going? And he's like, I got to leave. She says, no, you don't have to leave. And he's like, it's for the greatest good. And she's like, I am the greatest good that you've ever had, The point is, it doesn't matter what good you do if it's not the greatest good that should be done. It doesn't matter what good you do if it's not the greatest good that should be done. Like, it doesn't matter what good I do if I'm neglecting my wife and kids, like, they are my greater good. And so I could be doing all kinds of good things. Like, I could be at your house every night helping you fix stuff. Although you actually wouldn't want me to do that because I'm terrible at that kind of thing. But I could be doing that every single night, and it would be good for you. But if I'm doing that to get away from my wife and kids and to neglect them, it wouldn't matter how many good things I'm doing for you. I'm not taking care of that which is supposed to be greater. See, God being the greatest being that there is, it doesn't matter how much good we do. If we're neglecting him, then our good is considered wicked by him. It's not that what we do is bad. It's that we have things out of order. This person in verse 17 who is overly wicked, they're kind of the exact opposite of the person in verse 16 who is overly righteous. They're not trying to control God through their behavior. They're pursuing their independence from God. Right? The fool says in heart, there is no God. That's what we're trying to say. There is no God, and so I can do what I want to be. I can be free to be me. You know, like the song from, Sound of Music, right? I'm going to climb every mountain and ford every stream and follow every rainbow till I find my dream. Or, dare I mention Frozen? It's time to see what I can do to test the limits and break through. No right, no wrong. No rules for me. I'm free. I'm free. Right? That's the message of our culture. You need to be free. That's the highest ethic that there is. My question is, well, free to be what? Like, if our greatest freedom comes from independence from God, from just kind of self-expression, I mean, aren't we just full of contradictions? Be true to you, which part of you? If you're honest with yourself for a moment, which I always recommend being honest with yourself, you'll notice that there's competing desires in your heart. How do you sort out which one you should be true to? And not only that, but if we look inside of ourselves, I mean, do we always like what we see? Be true to yourself. Well, how does that work out if a person says their most authentic expression of themselves is as a racist? Friends, let's just be clear. Being true to yourself is probably the worst advice that you could ever be given. The only way to truly experience freedom is not just doing whatever pleases you in the moment, but instead submitting yourself to the right set of conditions. Here's what I mean by that. If someone wants to be a violinist one day and be able to be free to play whatever piece of music they want, well, that means that they're going to have to do what? They're going to have to say no to a lot of other things. Like, you can't study to be a classical violinist and not practice every single day. Like, if you want to play violin, but then also you want to play basketball, and the next day you want to be an author, and like you're going from thing to thing to thing, you're going to end up doing no thing very well. And so what happens if you say, I want to be a violinist, you're going to say, instead of practicing basketball, instead of writing or other creative expressions, I'm going to limit myself in order to pursue freedom to be this violinist. Right? By confining themselves and learning, that person will actually know what it is to truly be free as they develop the skill set needed to play anything. Limiting their freedom, in other words, is what gives greater freedom. And this is why verse 18 says, it is good that you should take hold of this, and from that withhold not your hand, for the one who fears God comes out from both of them. See, what delivers us from trying to control God through our good behavior or reject God through just being independent is surrendering to God, limiting ourselves and our freedom to the pursuit of him. This fear here is not the fear of terror. No, it's the proper reverence that the Almighty Maker, who holds all things together by the power of his will, the fear is giving that God his appropriate due, which is surrender. Which is life not on my terms, but life on your terms. Listen, we can live life on our terms and be all over the place and never really sure if we're going in the right direction. Or we can live life on God's terms and let him and his word be our guiding light and actually go somewhere. That's what will actually lead us to true freedom and to deliver us to hope. There's no hope in self-expression because we're always changing, and not everything we have inside ourselves should be expressed. And so our true hope comes in godly submission. Lord, have your way. Have your way in me. That's the prayer of freedom. That's the prayer of hope. So when life goes sideways, our perspective really does make a whole difference. We need to shift from anger at the curve to trusting in God. Not try to judge God based off of what is happening now, but rather trust God based upon who he's revealed himself to be in Jesus. We need to shift from trying to control to accepting what's been given. God, I don't want to change you. I want to use what you've allowed in my life. And then we need to shift from pursuing independence to practicing surrender. God, I don't want to follow the dead end of my own desires. I want to follow you to the path of freedom. And so my question for every single person watching this is, how do you need to shift? How do you need to shift? The first step is always the same: placing your faith in Jesus Christ. And so if you're watching this, you've yet to do that, I would encourage you not to miss this moment. But after this is done, go ahead, pray with a friend, maybe someone who sent you this link or another Christian that you know, and just tell them, I'm ready. Just tell them, I'm ready. I don't know where this is going to lead. I think sometimes we try to figure out where it's all going in order to take the first step. God just calls us to take the first step. Do you believe that Jesus is who he says he is? Are you ready to say, yes, I have faith in him? If so, man, I'd love to pray for you. Go ahead and reach out to me on social media, or talk to a family or a friend, someone who is a Christian. The first step to experiencing this hope and making this shift always starts return to Christ. But then the second step is for those of us who do believe, we need these continual reminders. I'm taking this text, I'm tearing it apart because I need these reminders in my heart. I think it's very easy for us to continually be pulled back to the dead-end perspective. And so my encouragement to you would be, why don't you text a friend today? Or why don't you pick up your phone and, talk about this sermon? Or, we're going to be talking about it coming up in small groups. We are big believers here at Christ Church that experiencing God comes through relationship with one another. Like how God does deeper work in us is through us being in community with one another. And so my encouragement to you would be, just talk about this. Talk about what are ways that life has gone sideways for you. What are shifts that you then need to make? Spend some time talking about that. Spend some time praying for one another. God loves you. And so he wants to show you how to find your hope in him. The path of life, it might take us sideways sometimes, but if our faith is in God, then we're going to make it through any bend that occurs, because he will be our unshakable hope. Would you bow your heads and pray with me?